This is Metabolic Mastery, a KORR Medical Technologies podcast dedicated to advancing knowledge and practice in metabolic testing. Welcome to Metabolic Mastery, brought to you by KORR Medical Technologies. I'm Dr. Marc Humbert. This is my co-host, Dr. Cameron Garber. And today we've got Coach Chris Navin with us. So Chris, let me read off all of his accomplishments. He's got a lot. So he's a triathlon and marathon coach who's done over 400 events in over 50 Ironman half. He's been doing metabolic testing for over 15 years. As an athlete himself, he's qualified for Team USA over 25 times, and he's coached over 50 people to world championships and one athlete to be a world champion. So awesome stuff. A storied career.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I would love to first just talk about your career, how you got into this thing. Obviously you're an athlete yourself. How did that play into things? What got you into this whole world of metabolic testing and coaching?
Yeah, well, I actually was not much of an athlete when I first was getting started. But I had a whole different career. I was doing information technology and risk management. So I was actually I joke around sometimes. I was a certified ethical hacker at one point in my career. So I was learning how to break into big banking systems and whatnot. And so I was a big data person, but a very different career. And as I wasn't in great shape, and I had a coworker who had just done a triathlon, and me and a bunch of friends were all inspired by him having done a triathlon. And we all probably gained 10, 20 pounds after college, getting into a 9-to-5 job. And so we were looking for a way to lose weight. And on a drunken New Year's Eve bet, we all signed up for a triathlon before midnight, before the New Year bell rang. We all held ourselves accountable to do a triathlon. And none of us had bikes. None of us knew how to swim, but we just committed to doing something. And that kind of got me on the journey of, training for endurance events. And it was many years after that where I got into triathlon. I fell in love with it, got into coaching and helping out with the local triathlon club. And then eventually, made a whole career shift. And I joke around, I went from certified ethical computer hacking to now biohacking, humans. So from computers to humans, but they're all systems. So I look at it kind of the same way of, input and output. You look at, when your heart rate shows you the input you're putting into your effort, and then the output would be like the pace or the power. And there's a lot of things around efficiency and that you can relate between looking at the human body as a system, as a performance machine, so to speak. So I got into coaching. Yeah, it's all data. There's more than data, but a good chunk of it is data. And then so I kind of left the desk job world, and I was planning to just take a year off, and I got certified as a coach and started coaching our local triathlon team and a big charity team, Team to End AIDS, that coaches people for the marathon and triathlon. And so I thought I would just be taking a year off and then going back to the 9-to-5 thing. But one year became 2 years, and then 2 years became 15 years. So I've been a full-time coach now for 15 years. So it's been a fun journey. We've done a lot over the years. When I became a full-time coach, one of the things I wanted to get into was more the data side of things. So I got into heart rate training and all that, and ultimately started working for a big health club in Chicago. So if you're familiar with like a lifetime health club, around the country, very similar to that. And they had an opportunity to kind of build out an endurance training center. And as we started doing that, I started looking into the pieces to become a USA Triathlon certified performance center. And one of the criteria for that was having different types of lab testing, so lactate and VO2. So I convinced the health club to make the investment in a big VO2 cart, and that kind of started the whole process. And then over the years, we found out that the applying the metabolic testing to not just endurance athletes, but general people getting into fitness, and with people getting smartwatches and heart rate monitors, that just kind of took off. And so we ended up building 7 metabolic labs across the Chicago area. So we used to bounce around and kind of manage the different metabolic carts. That ended up attracting more athletes too. So we did a lot with USA Triathlon, and our local triathlon club ultimately became the club national champions one year. So we got, just taking everyday athletes, teaching them how to train smarter and better, and keep progressing year after year. And then I got lucky working with a couple, pretty high performing athletes. And yeah, one of my top athletes, she won the national championship and the age group world championships, and then turned professional. And she's had a whole storied career herself as well. But yeah, most of my athletes are just everyday people, beginners, middle of the pack. But then I use myself as my own lab experiment. So just like I would break into computer systems and, try to, test out the things that I was learning, I throw myself through the ringer all the time to see if, if the numbers can actually be applied, and that's a big part of what I like to focus on, is showing people not just, hey, I'm doing a VO2 test to get a VO2 max score, but I can use the data from that test, your thresholds, your fat and carb metabolism data, to learn how to pace, to learn how to fuel, and then perform to the best of your ability. And so, yeah, I've used that to qualify for Team USA as an age grouper many times. And that's kind of my excuse now, is to travel the world somewhere new every year by qualifying for Team USA in a new multi-sport discipline. So I've done, aquathlon, aquabike, duathlon, triathlon, short distance, long distance, draft legal, non-draft. And so that's what kind of keeps me motivated, is just looking for those new goals and new challenges to apply some of the fun data stuff to endurance sports.
That's fascinating. That's awesome. What a fun way to keep yourself motivated. By changing the target just a little bit, it re-ups that motivation.
Yeah. Yep.
Love it.
Well, so with that, what have you learned from, how has competing in those different events modified your training? Like, what have you learned from each of those different events?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, at least locally in Chicago, know me for having been at and done a lot of like Ironman, like long distance events. But when I look at the data, I'm actually better on VO2 max and shorter distance things. And so, I look at it as a challenge to say, okay, if I'm more, maybe genetically gifted towards shorter distance, but I want to do well on longer distance, how do I adapt my training, and fueling and pacing and all that? And so I really use the data a lot to, look at metabolic efficiencies. So, these days everyone talks about, zone 2 training and figuring out their fat max point, like where's the peak fat oxidation for somebody. But then also, where's your anaerobic threshold? And then how do you improve those over time? And that's sometimes the real challenge for someone, depending on what their goals are. And actually, some of my most rewarding experiences were not working with like performance athletes, but just like everyday people at the gym. And I remember I've had, I think two, actually technically 3 people who I've brought to tears in a good way after doing a metabolic test, where and this was one that really got me thinking, like, okay, maybe I need to do more of this testing stuff. I had a client who was an older gentleman. He his fitness started declining. He couldn't figure out like why he was, not able to hang with these people he was doing group rides on cycling. And so he was just struggling. He was gaining weight. He couldn't figure out why he wasn't performing well. And, we did a test on him, and his VO2 max number was actually one of the lowest numbers I had ever gotten on somebody. And he did a full test. We hit his true VO2 max, but what we figured out was kind of where his fat oxidation point was peaking and where the opportunities were for improving his training. And, it was one of the worst test results. I had to, after the test, talk about his numbers and everything. And so I felt bad, like telling him his numbers were pretty low and kind of explaining everything. And then after the test, he went to the locker room, showered and changed. And when he came back, he was in tears. And I'm like, oh no, I really upset this guy. And he came up to me and said, you don't understand how meaningful this is to me. Like, I feel like I have now found the solution to why I was struggling. And now I have my roadmap. I know exactly what I need to do. And I've been struggling for so long. And it was just kind of like an eye-opening experience for them. And I've seen that time and again with a couple other people too, where either they were struggling with weight loss journeys, not seeing their fitness numbers improve. And then once they get the data and they see their metabolic profile and they understand like where they go anaerobic, where their aerobic threshold is or where they burn more fat, they understand like why they should do interval training a certain way or why they should have easy workouts and harder workouts. And it just gives people structure. And I feel that that's something that's always energized me is, helping people discover those types of things, whether they're starting their fitness journey or they're, an elite athlete. I also just tested a pro athlete, a sub 4-minute miler who had one of the highest VO2 max scores I've ever tested. And so I see that full spectrum, and I find it a challenge to figure out, okay, how can I, as a coach, one, relate to all these different types of athletes and be able to communicate how this information can be used. And I think that's the challenge for anyone, getting into coaching or getting into metabolic testing is just learning how to apply the numbers and use them combined with your experience. And so that's why I challenge myself to keep building my own experience so I can, I call myself a Swiss Army knife sometimes because I grew up in Switzerland. And so I like to be a little bit of a jack of all trades of, at least in the endurance sports world.
Yeah, very cool.
That is awesome.
So I would love if you dive more into this idea of metabolic profiling, right? Of taking a person and saying, hey, what are we seeing with your physiology? What do we need to do with your training? Because I think a lot of people have heard of VO2 max testing or metabolic testing, and really they've only seen this tiny part of what they can do, and there's probably some misconceptions. And so what kind of conversations do you have with clients about their metabolic profile? How do you break through some of those misconceptions and show them what really matters?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think one of the bigger ones I see these days is, I'd say in the last 5 years, especially, there's been a much bigger trend towards, health and longevity and zone 2 training in particular. And so a lot of people are just generally trying to figure out like, okay, zone 2, if I do 220 minus my age and I figure out, where my max heart rate is, I can estimate where my zone 2 is, and I have to train at this low heart rate. But sometimes they're underestimating that significantly or overestimating that significantly. And then there's a lot of, I think misconception around like, not everyone needs to train the same way either. If you're someone just doing a couple hours a week versus a pro athlete doing 20 hours a week. And so figuring out what you should be doing, what is unique to you and your current metabolic profile versus somebody else is what a lot of people kind of lose the big picture when they're trying to figure things out. So like one of the things that I've always found helpful is when someone does, especially a VO2 max test in particular, and we figure out where their, first threshold is and where their second threshold is, where they shift from fat burning to more carb burning, we begin to get that picture of their metabolic profile. And then somewhere around there, whether it's down around the aerobic threshold or somewhere higher up, we also find where their peak fat oxidation is. And for a lot of conditioned athlete, that point actually moves higher and higher and higher. And, the goal, for example, when I train somebody for an Ironman, they might start with their peak fat oxidation being down around that aerobic threshold, down around that zone 2 point. But then as they train more, they actually get more fat oxidation happening into zone 3. And especially at the elite level, we get, those top athletes, the pros training 20 hours a week, who have their fat oxidation points, 80, 85% of max heart rate, maybe just 10 beats below their anaerobic threshold. And, that is something that you wouldn't know unless you actually got tested. You might estimate it being a lot lower, but you can also trend that over time. So like when I start somebody, they might be at their fat oxidation down around 60, 65% of their max heart rate. And then they shift it up over time, and we can actually measure that improvement. I've had a number of just regular age group athletes who, their peak fat oxidation was just a couple hundred calories an hour, and it was down around 60%, down around zone 2. And then by the end of training, now their peak fat oxidation has been moved all the way up to the bottom of zone 4, actually. And so they've completely changed their metabolic profile. And I think that's the biggest takeaway and the real value for most people at least in endurance sports, to do metabolic profiling and understand, what their profile looks like compared to just using a random formula that gives you, whether it's, the maffetone, 180, or using max heart rate 220 minus your age, and just trying to estimate it. Don't waste the time estimating and training off by a bunch. Get the numbers right. And I think that was actually my biggest learning experience. So when I did my first metabolic test with the actual O2 and CO2 data, so where I can see, substrate utilization, I thought I was burning, the right amount of energy. And then I realized I was not oxidizing a lot of fat. And I tested myself leading into a big Ironman race. And it was only a month or two before the race. And so then I went back over my whole training season, looked at all my data, and realized that if I had done just my long bike ride of the week and my long run of the week at about 5 to 10 beats a minute easier, so training easier, not training harder, I would have burned enough additional calories through just fat oxidation over that 6-month period to end up being about 5 pounds lighter in terms of body fat, 3,500 calories, roughly for 1 pound of fat. So the amount of calories I would have burned in terms of from fat rather than from carbs would have been such that I probably would have lost about 5 pounds of body weight by training easier, not harder. And if I went to race day 5 pounds lighter, usually for me, every pound I'm lighter, I run about 5 seconds a mile faster. So it would have been about 25 seconds a mile faster from a running performance standpoint by training easier, not harder, which seems very counterintuitive to most people. And so that's where I found the numbers to be most beneficial, is just having that precision.
Yeah. And that's one of the concepts that I always try to hit home with people is if you're doing all the work, if you're putting in hours and hours, triathlon training is the ultimate, when you get into your big bricks, of your big training blocks where you are just spending tons of time in the pool, on the bike, running, and all this stuff. If you're investing that much time, why not have your efforts really reflect where your body's at? Why not make that as effective as possible? Because, you're investing so much into it, and to have that be something that's not really building you up the way we'd like it to, it's frustrating. People often will be like, so I've been doing this wrong my whole life. It's like, well, not quite. Like, obviously you built up a base of fitness and it was all good, but could you have made more progress, or could you have avoided some injuries and things like that? Like, yeah, probably so.
Yeah, I get that all the time. People are like, I wish I did this test like 2 years ago,
Yeah.
But it's fun. Like once people do a test and they see the value you get from your data, like I try to keep my most motivated and successful athletes are ones that actually come back every year, and we try to test them the same time of year so that every year you're 1 year older, you can see how you were performing, same time of your training cycle wise to when you were younger. And I have some people now I've tested well over a decade straight, and I have all their training data. And I know 2 gentlemen I tested last year. I both have 10 years of data on them. One of them improved their VO2 max. So even though they're 10 years older, one of them improved their VO2 max 25%. The other one did 33%. So it's almost like adding an extra lung to your body, essentially. And the biggest, correlation to that is been just training volume, like keeping them active and keeping them motivated. And if they know, like, hey, every year they have to come back for a VO2 max test with me, they're using that as motivation. That like, the accountability, exactly. And that keeps them motivated. And then their numbers are accurate, and they can not just see how their fitness is gaining as they're getting older, but now they're getting more motivated by that, and they keep training, they keep being active. And I've got people now in their 60s who are like outperforming where they were, in their late 40s. And so a lot of it is the accountability. And actually the other thing, like what you touched on is, injury prevention. That's like the big one as well, because, a lot of my athletes were asking me, I just did a little crazy endeavor where I did 4 triathlons at the Chicago Triathlon a couple of weeks ago. And so just racing all weekend, basically, rinse and repeat. The next day, I hopped on a plane. I flew across the world to Sydney, Australia, and did the Sydney Marathon the next weekend. And then after that, I hopped on a plane, came back to Chicago, and quickly did my laundry, and then went up to Madison, Wisconsin, and I did a back-to-back. I did a half Ironman on Saturday and a full Ironman on Sunday. So over this like 2-week span, I did, I forget the exact numbers, but I think it's like, over 5 miles of swimming, over 220 miles of cycling, and over 80 miles of running, in races. And so race intensity, 80 miles of running, that's a lot of, stress to put your body through. And obviously I had never done something quite this compressed before. I've done, back-to-back, marathons pretty close to each other, and Ironmans maybe a month or so apart, but never all of that volume in such a short period of time. And so I intentionally wanted to set a good example of, obviously it's something crazy I wouldn't recommend for someone else to do, but I used my metabolic data and basically just figured out, okay, from a fat oxidation standpoint and fueling perspective, what intensity would I really have to be doing these at to ensure that I'm not getting too, glycogen depleted? Because once the muscle runs out of, sugar, now the muscle is not supporting the body and the joint takes on all that impact force. And so I just did the math and was like, okay, I can't race these events at full intensity, but I can safely race them at these lower intensities. And so I just dialed everything back, and I was able to do everything. And I felt fine. I just ran 18 miles this past weekend, just a week or two after that. So, and no major aches or pains. And so a lot of people, I think, don't realize that, like, especially to build endurance safely, you really need to be training at the right intensities. And 9 times out of 10, especially with running, we see people, they gain fitness and they just keep trying to run more volume at higher intensities, and then they end up getting injured.
And you hit on so many things that I just think are so critical. I love it, love it, love it. Because exactly, we can talk about training volume or training intensity, but increasing volume and intensity at the same time is the recipe for injury. Most people think if I just run a little bit faster every day, I'll get faster. And I tell people, like, that is the exact recipe for how to get a stress injury or a tendon injury or things. Really, you can increase volume or intensity, but volume and intensity at the same time is not a good idea. And so there's times when you build volume and build that base, and there's times when you build intensity, and they're both good. And we need to work on both things, but you can't do both at the same time. So I love, because you'll work with those marathoners that are like, I run a marathon basically every weekend. I'm collecting medals,
Yeah.
and you're like, that can be fine. You just can't race all of them. There's a difference between running in a race and racing them. And you can't expect to podium every single weekend, or you will get injured. Whereas, like, yeah, you can do your long run and just wear a bib while you're doing it, and that's totally fine as long as you're pacing yourself adequately, that you're keeping intensity low enough that it's more of a volume run than an intensity run. And so that's awesome. I love that you hit on those points, because that really is the power of doing this kind of testing, is that we can create a formula for you as an individual of, like, this is the way you need to train for where your body's at right now, so that we can avoid injury and maximize your potential for whatever your goal is. If it's to, improve VO2 max and do the shorter distance stuff, we can show you the formula for that. If it's, I want to crush these long distance events, okay, we can show you the formula for that. But it's the ability to individualize that to the athlete for where they're at. It's so powerful. So I love that story. Was awesome, actually. That made my day.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other example I like to use a lot too, hitting on kind of the points that you're making, is, and it ties mostly to injury prevention, but even more so to just like performance, like people who want to Boston qualify in a marathon, for example. And like, so many people push too hard and get injured. And I'm trying to remember the name of the individual, the CNN reporter who ran the Boston Marathon, I think a year or two ago. And he ended up pushing so hard. He got rhabdo and ended up in like the hospital and stuff like that. So like, these like, big name people who are out there in a public setting, well-known individuals, and they have their own coaches and personal trainers, and they do all this, but then on race day, they just don't execute well and they end up blowing up. And the example, when I crunch the numbers for people, usually like if you look at, for a marathon, how many calories someone burns per mile. So if you take like the average calorie burn rate per mile and the average individual, how much glycogen they might have in their muscles, liver, blood, all that. And you do the math, and the average marathon runner, if they're running a little too hard, if they're running closer to their threshold, they will bonk at mile 18.5 of the marathon. Like they will run out of muscle glycogen. And that's why people talk about hitting the wall at mile 20, right? Because they drink a little bit of Gatorade, so they get a little further than mile 18.5. But around that, right after that point, they start hitting the wall. And I remember Strava had posted some data years ago around how well people raced marathons. And they said only, I think it was at the time, somewhere between 8 to 12% of marathon runners negative split the marathon, meaning they finish strong. They finish the second half faster than the first half. So that means 90% roughly of marathon runners out there are running marathons incorrectly. Like they're risking injury and they're risking, having a good performance. So if 90% of people out there don't know how to pace a marathon, like that's like an epidemic, that's a big issue. That's why there's so many physical therapy businesses out there. So I like using the data to show people like how to now negative split a marathon. And that's my key point for all my Chicago Marathon athletes. So we got the Chicago Marathon coming up. So if anyone listens to this around then, I track a metric on all of my athletes and how many of them negative split the marathon. So I hold them accountable to seeing if they can pace it well. And we started out at like 7%, like around the average. And I think last year we were at like 17%, so almost more than double that. And so my goal is to keep pushing that number up and helping people, learn how to negative split their marathons.
I love it. Well, it is such a problem. And there's a lot of reasons why people have positive splits, right? Where they come out too hot because they're excited in the race environment. And it's so easy to pick somebody and be like, I should beat them. And so you stick with them and you have no idea how they've been training, but you, anyway, but that is so fun to hear. That's awesome that you're improving with that group, how they finish the race, because it's so important to build up their ability to train in a way that avoids injury and stays healthy, helps keep them on the road. Because in the end, that's the most important factor for our long-term health anyway, is that we stay on the road, and injury definitely derails us. So that's awesome.
Well, I was listening to one of the podcasts you've been on, and I don't remember if it was your story or if it was your co-guest, I guess we'll call it, but it was of like you're like out the gate and this one guy passed them and you didn't see him. One of the two of you didn't see him until like mile 20, and then you beat him by like almost an hour. Was that your story? Was that the other story? Like
that was my actually, I think that was it was my first ever Ironman. And this athlete I would see at local races all the time. Usually I would always beat him at the local races. And then at Ironman, he passed me, I think at like mile 4 of the marathon. He caught up to me and passed me. I'm like, wait, I'm a better runner than him. Like, how is he passing me? And I didn't see him again until mile 20 of the marathon. I caught up to him and he had bonked so hard at that point. He basically was walking the last 6 miles of the marathon. And if you do the math, if you're walking at a slow pace, that's almost like a 20-minute mile. And I had gotten, I was just consistent and I had been fueling well. And I started fueling more once I saw him. I'm like, oh, maybe I can beat him now. And so I pretty much held around a 10-minute mile the rest of the way. So if he was running a 20-minute mile or walking a 20-minute mile and I was running a 10-minute mile, that's, 10 minutes times 6 miles. I finished in my finish time. I think my first Ironman, it was like 13 hours and he finished at, I think, 14 hours. So I beat him by an hour, even though I only passed him with 6 miles to go.
That's wild.
And, when I looked at the data well after the race, that kind of really clicked with me about how important fueling is, as well as pacing. Is you can do fueling well, but pacing bad and perform horribly. Or you can either variable can affect your performance. But if you nail both of them, then you've really got the ability to master any type of endurance, race. And that's why I kind of pride myself. Like honestly, I don't think I've bonked since I've done my first metabolic test. Like I've learned how to pace, and, I look at my metabolic numbers, and then I used all the fat oxidation, carb combustion numbers to figure out, like, okay, how much do I need to be fueling with for these events that I'm doing? And if you're always on top of both of those, like, yeah, there's nothing you can't do.
Yeah. And
especially the longer in distance somebody goes, the more exponentially important that is.
Right.
Like I know my first ultra marathon I didn't actually train for it. I had been doing marathons, and we signed up for Two Oceans, which is an ultra marathon down in Cape Town, South Africa. And their ultra running is a whole different game. For those who aren't familiar, in the US, I think the largest ultra marathon is under 2,000 people. And in South Africa, they have the Two Oceans Ultra Marathon, which is a 35-mile race, and the Comrades Marathon, which is one of the oldest marathons in the world, is a double marathon, 26.2 times 2 nonstop. And they get 20,000 people doing these events. So it is like the entire Chicago Marathon field with everybody doing an ultra marathon. So it's a whole different culture down there. And so when I signed up to that event, I didn't realize how big these events were, and I started getting more and more intimidated. But I'm like, all right, I'm just going to stick to my numbers. And I knew, what pace I can hold and what I needed to fuel at. And I remember the 26.2 mile point was at the top of a mountain. So you were finishing your marathon at the top, and you still had another, 9 miles to go. But I was proud to say I ran that event start to finish, never walked a single step other than like walking into a porta potty at one point. And it was just because I knew my numbers. And even though I didn't, train to kind of push a high intensity, I knew metabolically what I was capable of and what I needed to fuel with. And that enabled me to do that event safely, even though I might not have trained as much volume as I might have wanted to do. So just a way of teaching people how to, listen to their body and train and race safely.
Yeah. I love it.
Well, so I would love to hear you go a little bit more into the fueling strategies. I know you've talked about like level 1 testing versus level 2 testing. And if, would you kind of describe what your purpose is you're trying to accomplish with the different type of tests you do? Dive in a little bit more to what those tests look like, why you're doing them.
Yeah, and it just depends on, the athlete's background more than anything, like what their goals are. But usually if someone has never done a metabolic test, I always just like starting with the basic VO2 max test, and they'll get some of that metabolic, profile data in terms of fat and carb combustion. But you're mostly doing it to figure out like, their VO2 max number. A lot of people just want to know where that number is. A lot of people want to know where their anaerobic threshold is, because then you can figure out your heart rate zones. And then the third major piece of, useful and practical information that you get from the test is that metabolic profile. Like, where do you burn fats? Where do you burn carbs? So you can figure out the heart rate zones and set up those heart rate zones based on your metabolism. But then when you get to like, you're not just doing, a short distance triathlon or a half marathon. Like now you're moving up to doing maybe a full marathon, or you're doing half Ironman, full Ironman, like events that are taking more than 4 hours, potentially more than 8 hours, potentially more than 12 hours. Fueling becomes so much more important. And when we do like, that's when we'll get into more specifics with testing of, testing you at your exact power on the bike if you're a cyclist, or your running pace if you're a runner. And so instead of doing the standard VO2 max test, which usually involves like doing more incline and speed increases when you're just trying to get the heart rate to gradually go up and hit VO2 max, now you're doing testing where you're going a little bit longer in duration, a little more gradual, and we're getting more of that metabolic profile data a little bit more accurate. And so typically I call that a level 2 VO2 test. Like we do a basic VO2 for the first test on somebody, and that might be at the start of their season. And then when they're getting into the peak, maybe like 2 months out from a major event, they want to know how much their fitness has improved, have their zones changed, but now they're really getting into fueling as well. And so we'll do that longer duration test to get a really nice detailed metabolic profile on somebody. And then they use that to figure out, okay, if I'm burning this much or oxidizing this much from fat and I'm combusting this much from carbs and glycogen, you can start to figure out, okay, how much do you need to fuel based on the intensity you're doing and the duration, the distance of the event that you're doing. And you can get very precise. And, you know, I think that's probably the biggest thing that's changed in, especially the last 5 years, is all the new sports nutrition products that have, you know, higher carb concentrations and they're more easily digested. And now that people are able to digest these, the osmolality, like the absorption is much better. Now people can take in more calories and actually push higher intensities than we thought they could. And that's why you're seeing, especially in like Ironman and even just marathons, people breaking records, you know, left and right. It's, you know, part of it is the technology is always changing with shoes and bikes and all that, but a lot of it is, I'd say, more so the fueling aspect. And so when I do that level 2 test, that's the biggest thing I do then is then take their metabolic profile. And then we get very specific about, all right, you're taking in, you know, 1 gel every 5K. You're going to be hydrating with this amount. You're going to be getting this amount of carbs in. And we just get very, very specific because, you know, if you're off by even just like 20 or 30 calories an hour, and you multiply that out over hours and hours and hours, that can be a big, big difference between bonking and not bonking, or having your, you know, usually with the runners, it's, if anyone's done a marathon and they've had their calf muscle cramp up, you know, the calf muscle is a lot smaller than your, you know, glutes, hamstrings, quads. So it's usually like one of the first muscles to go when it runs out of glycogen. And you see all those people on the side of a marathon, like right around mile 20, right? People are like standing on the side of the road, stretching out their calf muscle because like so they feel the pain in the calf muscle, and that pain is happening because not like they didn't stretch or they didn't hydrate necessarily. It's just glycogen depletion. And if you deplete yourself of glycogen, you know, I forget the number. It's, for every gram of carbs your body stores, you store about 3.5 grams, I think, of water with it.
3 to 4 grams of water.
3 to 4 grams, right? So, you know, think about if you get glycogen depleted, all that hydration that your body had stored in it is gone. So, you know, the importance of keeping those glycogen stores and the sugar levels up makes a big, big difference. And if people have struggled with that, that's a red flag that they're either pacing too hard, not fueling enough, or both. And that's where I think the real power of metabolic testing in general can really help a lot of people, you know, 90% of marathoners as a good example.
Yeah, absolutely. So how much do you love the new long form testing mode with the CardioCoach to be able to do some of these longer tests and stuff?
Yeah, I used to beforehand have to do like multiple tests on people, like do a full test, stop, recalibrate, do another test, and then I have to like extract all the manual data, throw it in a spreadsheet, and make all these graphs manually. Now you can just have those graphs and the data in one report. So just from like and this is more for, you know, from a coach or business perspective, just the ability to very efficiently administer a test. And literally, it takes me about 5 minutes just to like look through the data real quick, double check the numbers, and then I can generate a full report and have the consultation with somebody right then and there. I don't have to wait and, you know, schedule a consult, you know, a couple of days later or whatnot.
Right.
And so that for me was one of the reasons I've always stuck with especially the core medical CardioCoach system, because I can just get that reporting right away. And it gives the graphs, you know, I can see the crossover points for metabolic efficiency. That's like the big thing that we look at is, you know, where do you cross over from burning more fat to more carbs, and being able to show people where that point is, and then have just all the data laid out right there is been the you know, the most helpful thing for me just trying to be able to, make a business and career out of metabolic testing. Because if
Right.
I had a machine that was not that efficient, it would be a lot harder to do. And actually, I have a whole team of coaches I've worked with over the years. One of them, he's now working on his PhD. Um, and he's working in a lab, and he texted me yesterday. He did 9 VO2 tests on somebody. And he has like 10 more today, and he's just like cranking out these tests, over and over and over again. And so for a really dialed in business or lab, that's what you need to be able to get to, is the ability to, deliver good, accurate results, which is hard to do sometimes. And then also be able to get the reporting data to somebody very efficiently. Because that's like, as soon as someone's done a test, they have all these thoughts in their head. They want to see their numbers. They want to know how to use it. And that really is the best time to like get someone to absorb and understand the information. And so I literally, like, when I do a test, usually my goal is, as soon as the test is done, I have people download the CardioCoach app on their phone, get their metabolic results on their phone. I even have them. I really like the Garmin Connect IQ data field, because you can get people downloading their metabolic profile right onto their Garmin watch, like right then and there. And then every workout they do from that point on, they can see the fat and the carb, breakdown. And when people see that, when they see those numbers for their metabolic profile, and they're like, oh, wow, I just did that long run, and 90% of the energy I burned was coming from, carbs, and I only burned this much fat. Now I understand why I'm not losing weight while I'm marathon training. I call it the year 2 marathoner syndrome, is because the first year someone trains for a marathon, they're just starting training and they lose, weight, and they gain fitness, and now they're running at a higher intensity. And then the second year, their second marathon, now they're just training at that higher intensity all the time, not realizing that they're burning lots of carbs. And so they're on this blood sugar roller coaster where they finish a long run and they're just craving carbs, and then they overeat, and then they just have this kind of blood sugar roller coaster going on, and they're not losing weight, and they can't figure out why. They're training the same amount, or they're training more, and they're not losing weight, and they just don't understand why. And then once they see and they understand the whole fat and carb, metabolic profile, so to speak, then it's like an eye opener. And like, that's the easiest way for me as a coach to get people to buy into, whether it's zone 2 training or why I want you running a slower pace for certain runs. It's not to run slow. It's to, oxidize more fat and develop your metabolic efficiency. And once they buy into that,
Right.
then it's like, they're good. I don't have to struggle convincing an athlete to hit their paces or their heart rate numbers.
Right.
They buy into the program. They understand it. And so I think that's the hardest thing sometimes for a coach, is to get some athletes to understand that. And when you have the data, it's crystal clear, they know, and, people will follow the plan, hopefully a little more accurately then.
Totally. One of my favorite things to do when I have an athlete that's really struggling to buy into the whole zone 2 concept. There's, they get done with a run and they're used to feeling like, whew, that was a good workout. I just, beat myself up, and that's what I'm supposed to do. When you get done with a zone 2 run, you're usually like, I could go and do that again. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, yeah, that's the whole point, is so that you can do it again tomorrow and the next day and the next. So when they're struggling with this concept of like, this is way slower than I expected, especially when they're first starting out with doing low intensity training, because they're used to spending 90% of the time in zone, mid to high zone 3 for every run that they do. And so it's a mental shift really to get into zone 2 training. So I'll have them come in, we'll do a long form mode test, but I'll just have them like, do your regular workout, but stay above 50% fat burn the whole time. Like, just try it. And it's so funny to be like, yeah, that's how slow you need to run to stay in zone 2. And they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I had to be that slow. It's like, yeah, for now, but in 6 weeks, if you stick with it, it'll get way, way faster. Within 12 weeks, you'll be able to jog like you were before. You're just going to be way more efficient at it when you do it. You can get to where you're running the same paces but be burning fat. You just have to put in the work at the lower intensity to where your low intensity becomes what your moderate intensity used to be.
Yeah, when you can give people their numbers and they they see it on the phone app or they see it on their Garmin, they can buy into it. They know the objective of this workout is to get that, 50% fat burn happening, and they can have that number to shoot for. The other thing I like, I don't know if you've done this before, any runners now, I've kind of redeveloped our marathon programs over the year. And, my coaching business called the Metabolic Athlete is the, my metabolic lab business. And so we call it the metabolic athlete method for marathon training. And so what we do for long runs is especially when people know and have gotten their zones dialed in, whether they've done a metabolic test or not, I have them generally do almost all of their long runs where the first half of the long run, they have to keep it down in a more metabolically efficient zone, whether it's zone 2, zone 3. And then the second half of the run, they can shift into their goal marathon pace. And so like last weekend, we just had people doing their big peak, their 20-mile or 22-mile run, getting ready for the Chicago Marathon. And when you can get an athlete to do a 20-mile run and they can actually run the second 10 miles faster than the first, then that's when they've actually like really bought into it. Like they don't only see their numbers on the app from shorter distance runs, but now they go and they actually try to put it into practice, and they end up running faster in the second half of a run that long. Then all of a sudden that really gives them a sense of achievement, and that empowers them now to understand, why they need to be a little bit more precise on their pacing. And that's the biggest win. Like I've had a few, and it doesn't happen often, but I've had a few first time marathoners usually always, blow up. They don't do that well in the final miles. But now I'm getting routinely people doing their very first marathon and they're negative splitting and they're finishing the marathon strong. They're not getting injured. They're finishing with a smile on their face. Their finisher photos actually look good. And that then they cross that finish line. They're like, all right, I want to do another one, versus usually when people finish their first marathon, they're like, never again, and maybe they do one eventually, but they don't feel that great after crossing the finish line. And it's just such an empowering thing, like for people who, for whatever reason struggle with, training, life in general, just having that positive experience, really, really is a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always the question I ask people when they say they want to run a marathon. I'm always like, how do you want that day to go? Do you want to be miserable the whole time and get done and think, I never want to do this again? Or do you want to enjoy the process and not be sore for 2-3 weeks afterwards, or injured for the next 6-8 weeks? Like, how do you want that day to go? Because we can get you there either way. Like, but I would prefer you enjoy the process and enjoy the day. So let's train that way.
Yeah.
Well, so I think just this whole conversation brings up the point that you can't separate physiology from psychology, right? Like the wonderful thing is that we have the data so that we can track and show them things, but being able to use that data to tell a story that's going to get them to buy in, I think ends up being so important at the end of the day. And it's getting them to buy in to better health, to better performance, to feeling better. So with that, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned about dealing with people's psychology to help them get the most out of what they're doing?
Yeah, I think I always look at each person differently, because some people just have different motivations, for whatever reason. But actually, when I started my coaching business coming out of the pandemic, I started my own company and was trying to think of, what do I want it to be? What do I want to call it? What have I found with the athletes I've had who've been the most successful? Like, what do they do right? Because what is it, psychologically that's motivating them to perform well? And so I've broken it down. That's why I actually call my coaching business is 4-star endurance. And I have 4 main points that are kind of built around like the different methods of motivation or the secrets of success for certain types of athletes. And like the first one is having a training plan. And when I do a metabolic test, and I can actually take someone's metabolic profile and apply it to their training plan, like updating their zones or whatnot, now they've got a plan that is tailored to them, and they buy into that. Like some people, you give them the plan and they will execute it. And if you can get that plan to be more, specific and more individualized to them, they're going to be super successful and they'll buy into it. The second one is just doing, regular testing. When a lot of athletes just get motivated by seeing their numbers. Like you tell them, hey, at this heart rate is where you're burning fat, or this heart rate is where you're burning carbs. Like they see that number, they connect with it, they'll execute to it. And I think doing that on a consistent basis, like not just one time, but like, usually most of my athletes, I test them once a year. If it's just a regular athlete, if it's someone training for a big event, twice a year, but they will buy into it when they see their numbers. And some people are more numbers focused and some are more visual. So to get some people motivated, like the numbers might go in one ear, out the other for some athletes, but having good graphs and charts, like on the new reports from KORR, I like those a lot because I can play around with them too. And when I show people the visual, that sometimes is what finally gets it to click. Like some people are just more visual than the numbers oriented. So testing. And then the biggest part of, and this is how I usually tell people, like my testing experience is a little bit different from like, let's say going to a university lab where they just administer the test, they give you the results, but they might not have the experience to explain like how you should use these numbers for your training and racing. So I try to always focus on education. Like I need someone to understand how metabolism works and how their numbers work, because once they've done that, then again, for some people, that can be the flipping the switch that really keeps them motivated. Is now they have the knowledge. It's like teaching someone to fish, right? You're not just giving them the fish, you're teaching them to fish. They now know how to look at their own data, how to analyze it. They're learning now more about metabolism. Maybe they're getting a little more interested. They're reading more, they're researching more on their own. So that's the third star of my 4-star endurance. And the fourth one is just having fun. So I try to have people really like apply things in a fun way somehow, because, when you smile, when you connect with something, and that can be a wide number of things, but from the data perspective, like for some people, they get inspired by different things. Like some people, I coach a lot of charity athletes. So for them, it's like the cause. They just want to train. They get motivated by the community, by, the fun atmosphere, training with other people, being able to hold pace with someone else. So that might be someone's motivation. But for someone who's more numbers oriented, I do a lot with gamification too. Like there's a lot of systems out there that gamify heart rate training. If like the one I've used over the years, especially in the health club setting, is the MyZone system. So like at the gym, people see their heart rate numbers up on the screen, but a lot of people like they see the number, but they don't actually pay attention to it. Because it doesn't feel like the number makes sense for them. Like maybe it looks like it's too high or it's too low. And once they do a metabolic test, I actually, like back at the gym, I used to go into that MyZone system and update their zones to match their metabolism. And then the colors match how they feel. And now they feel better and they get motivated because we do the gamification where you earn points based on, how many minutes of working out you do at different zones. And so for a lot of people, the gamification of fitness can be a really empowering tool. Like I know with that MyZone system, I have had people on it now for over 10 years and they
Wow.
have hit their numbers every month for literally 10 years in a row. And they get a little trophy and an award and whatnot every month. And it's amazing. Like we have people who literally, it's done on a monthly basis where they will, if they're traveling for work and they're in like a hotel room and they, it's like almost midnight, they'll be like, oh no, I didn't have my numbers for the month. And they'll just jog in place in the hotel room to get their heart rate up, to hit the numbers, just to, check the box. And so for some people, that gamification, that fun aspect is really what it seals the deal, so to speak. So people do all 4 of those things. Those are the main kind of like methods of motivation I use as a coach. Is make sure they have a plan, make sure they're testing regularly, make sure they're learning what they're focusing on, and then having fun with it. And that's, I think, when you can actually get the data to connect with somebody, to just keep doing what you're doing,
Right.
and be more successful in the long term.
It turns the data into a lifestyle.
Yeah.
And so it's not just this thing they're doing right now. It's something that they want to stick with, where you just made fitness into like brushing their teeth, where they can't go to bed until they've, brushed their teeth or also gotten their number of steps in that day or whatever. It's made it part of their life and lifestyle versus just this like punishment for the cheese blizzard they ate last night or whatever, it makes it so much more impactful when it's a lifestyle versus are the ways we punish ourselves for our other bad choices.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm thinking about some of the things that you've said of you know, what is their metabolism telling me, right? What's happening in their body? How do I teach them to fish? And that's one of the beautiful things about this data is like we're capturing their exact physiology, what's going on, and then it makes all these tools we have effective, right? The my zones to gamify it, or now that I know my metabolic profile, I can use the goos and the gels and things in such a way that I actually understand what I'm doing with it, right? I'm not just randomly taking it. I'm like, oh no, I'm taking it because this is what's happening physiologically. I think when we understand that, right, what's happening internally, we have at least a basic understanding of what's going on in our bodies. Then we can use that data to make better decisions, and then we use the tools. But unless we have the data from what's actually happening, those tools are just often shots in the dark. And so I love what you're doing with that. Another thing that you said earlier that I wanted to make sure that we didn't miss, because I think this is such a huge key, is you mentioned there are people that you've worked with that as they've gotten older, they've improved their fitness training this way, and they're actually better than they were when they were younger.
I wanted to mention this too.
Yeah, because I think this is something like we just see this, there's this inevitable decline, right? The older I get, just the less fit I get. And there's just so much that we can do to intervene. I think what people don't understand is it's like, yeah, that declines if we're not intervening. If you're not doing, cardiovascular training, endurance training, if you're not doing resistance training, then yeah, but we can do so much now to improve, to maintain, to make sure that you don't have this just long decline until you are in your older
Yeah.
years, like suffering from chronic health conditions.
Yeah. We were talking before the call, we were talking about how I tested somebody that qualified for Boston Marathon, Medicare, and the Ironman World Championships all in the same month. And what was fun is when she competed in the Ironman World Championships, she had done so 10 years previous. So in 2013, and then again in 2023. In 2023, her finish time was actually faster after doing metabolic training, faster than her 2013 time at 55. So, I
Yeah,
mean, that's really cool when you can say that. Like, I'm more fit now as a Medicare recipient than I was 10 years ago when I was still working and still, like that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I've one athlete who he's been big on fitness but not marathon running, but he ran the Boston Marathon in college. So around, I think, like 20 years old. He's now 50 years older, and he's trying to qualify for the Boston Marathon. And so, that would be a pretty awesome, achievement to do, the Boston Marathon 50 years apart. And, a lot of it can be done. Like, people think, the older we get, the fitness declines. Like, no, it's really just tied to activity level. And if you stay motivated and you stick to the plan and you're following that, like those individuals I mentioned earlier, where like one of them improved 25%, one of them about 33%. If I looked at their training volume data over that 10 years, they went from like 6 hours of training to maybe like 9 hours of training. And whatever that percentage improvement was in the volume and the activity level, there's usually a pretty direct correlation to the improvement in their VO2 max, with that, regardless of the intensity and all that. And obviously the more accurately they train, the better the results, but there's a very clear direct correlation to that. So a lot of it is just getting motivated. And yeah, I have some pet peeves with like the newer apps and devices out there, because some of them do a better job or worse job of motivating and whatnot. Like if, I don't know how many of you use Garmin watches and you see, the VO2 max estimation on like the Garmin watches, and people have their numbers like going up and down quite a bit, like from day to day or from week to week, the numbers are just going up and down, like new max heart rate, and it's like, no, my fitness hasn't changed that much. But some of the apps and devices have gone a little bit too far in like, I love the AI. I love the adaptive elements of all these tools. But a lot of them are developing this. They're still maturing. And a lot of the devices will sometimes, unfortunately, demotivate people just like they motivate people sometimes.
Totally.
And so I think until someone goes through and actually gets their own data and sees their own number from an actual administered test that reflects their true metabolism, and they're not just getting an estimate based on a aggregated, usually it's like a bell curve formula that was developed for the general population. And it can very significantly underestimate or overestimate where somebody is. And for better or worse, that can be a benefit or a detriment. And, there's so many adaptive tools out there now, which are great. And I love them and I use them. But I found the real power is when you have an adaptive or AI powered tool that you can then go in and actually update with someone's true metabolism, because
Right.
then it's like that is just the best of both worlds. Like you can get some really powerful results when that data is, more adaptive and more accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. When you have real numbers behind it, it's so much more powerful. I'm always frustrated with like my Garmin watch when it tells me, I live in the mountains, kind of in the foothills of the mountains here in Utah, and so my morning run is often 800 or 1,000 feet of elevation gain, and when I've just climbed 1,000 feet and kept my heart rate in zone 2 the whole time, and it tells me -2 fitness, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me. You know what I just did and kept my heart rate that low? That's incredible. And it's telling me because my pace was lower that my fitness was down. And it's like, yeah, but it has no idea the fact that I just climbed 1,000 feet in, a mile and a half in 95-degree weather. So anyway,
Yeah, and I love Garmin devices. Actually, the Garmin engineers were just in town here in Chicago last weekend, and I was doing GPS beta testing for them with like military grade backpack and like running with like 5 Garmin watches on, and they do an amazing job. Like they really have done a great a great job at creating some of the best, I
for
think,
sure.
tools out there. But the tool is only as good as the data going into it. And I think if people want to have one takeaway of like, what else should you do besides doing metabolic testing? One, make sure you have an accurate heart rate monitor, and make sure you don't have, bad data going into your device. Because a lot of those devices, rely on that. And I think, going and doing an in-person metabolic test is a great way to like just recalibrate and reinforce, like, is my app, is my device having accurate data in it? Is it relying on optical heart rate on the wrist, or do you have at least an upper arm optical is better,
Chest strap.
or
Yeah.
chest strap, and then just rechecking, and then having that just be confirmed. Like in the best case scenario, like every athlete I have, if I just see them for a lab test, I'll tell them as a follow up, I want to see at least 2 field tests, whether it's like going out and doing a race, like a 5K or a half marathon, because I want to reconfirm what I'm seeing in the lab with what we see out in the field, and, verify the devices you're using are accurate, but also environmental conditions, a hot condition field test and a cool condition field test and a lab test. If you have all 3 of those, then your numbers are super precise. And I literally, over the years, I've done so much testing on myself. Like I can tell you where my heart rate is within like 1 or 2 beats usually without even looking at my heart rate, because I've done so much testing under different environments that I've developed a good feel for, what my body is doing. And I think that's something I would love to see more people, achieve themselves too.
Yeah. Yeah. That when you're that dialed in, it really is fun. You get good at measuring distances too. You're like, oh no, that's probably like 0.78 miles. And people are like, what? You're like, well, I've run that like 30 times this last couple of months. I know exactly how far each of those distances are. It's funny how you dial in your heart rate,
Yeah.
distances, things like that when you train that much.
Yeah. And sometimes too, the other learning experience I love to share with people is when they do a test and we start talking about, like fat oxidation, how the body works and all that. It gets people thinking about just like oxygen more,
Mm-hmm.
and breathing more. And, they start thinking about how do I become more efficient, whether it's like working on biomechanics or working on breathing, because oftentimes that's a limiter for people. And I coach a lot of swim lessons. So I actually talk about like oxygen and CO2. I geek out on that while I'm teaching people how to swim and breathe. And, 9 times out of 10, people just don't realize like how the body works. And besides just seeing the data, learning about like, hey, yeah, if you want to oxidize body fat as a fuel source, you need to make sure you're getting good oxygen in and breathing. And so one of my favorite things to do is yell at my athletes when I see them late in races, like running a marathon. I say, just breathe, like get more oxygen in. And it's amazing how like that little biohack of just getting, it's like fanning the flame. Like you put more oxygen into a fire, that campfire burns and produces more energy. And the human body works in the same way in a lot of ways. So if you can get people to understand those connections now when they're running, like, I look at someone, I'm like, just breathe. And they know, okay, now I need to do my breathing exercises for the next couple of miles because coach is paying attention to me. And I think that is just a learning experience. That's something that you start to learn the more you connect the data with what you're actually doing out in the field as well.
Absolutely. It just becomes this blend of art and science, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Couple more questions, but really, like, if you only had like 5 minutes with someone, just a few minutes, what would be the biggest takeaways that you'd want them to have? What message would you give them to say, like, hey, go out and do this, and this is going to be the next best thing for your health?
Oh, that's a tough one. It depends on the person. That I think teaching someone to understand metabolism is always the most powerful thing. So I and people who've worked with me for many years have, maybe I might sound like a broken record for talking about this a lot, but I call it my campfire analogy, which is actually what I was just talking about, is, teaching people about how the body works and thinking about like a campfire. Like your body works in a very similar manner. Like you take a gram of carbs, you throw it in the fire, it burns right away and it creates, 4 calories of energy. You take a gram of body fat essentially and throw it in the fire. It doesn't actually burn right away. You have to fan it with more oxygen first, and then it burns. But then the energy that comes out of that, you get 9 calories roughly for every gram of fat oxidation. So you get more energy out of your body's fat stores. And like, it's an efficient way for your body to carry energy, if you're going and doing an endurance event. So body fat is a good thing if you know how to use it properly. And I think just teaching people about, breathing and the biomechanics of breathing to build endurance and to oxidize more body fat can be a big, light switch moment for a lot of people. So usually if I had 5 minutes with somebody, I'd probably talk to them and explain that. Usually when I have a new marathon runner and I see they're struggling on our group runs, I go and run with them for a while and I start asking them questions and talk about it. And invariably I'll use that campfire analogy to talk about metabolism. And then the next time I see them, I can actually like see and hear them breathing deeper when they're running. Yes. And they feel more energized. So that's probably one of my favorite ones to use.
Yeah.
Love it.
Oh, I love that. Okay. So this is a question that I've had since the beginning, because you talked about, you talked about how, you started in information, data analysis and everything, switched into this. Like, what did your college buddies that you signed up for this triathlon think of that? Like, were they surprised? Like, was it kind of a joke among you? Like, what's the end of that story?
Yeah, so a lot of them, it's fun. Most of them, we've all grown up. Some people have had kids, different careers, things have changed. They haven't gotten as crazy into endurance sports as I have. But I still see them coming back into triathlon. I work part-time for Super Tri, owns the Chicago Triathlon. It's one of the world's largest triathlons. And in Chicago, it's kind of like the reunion weekend of every triathlete in Chicago. Like people just come back to that race. And a lot of them are still doing triathlon. They've gotten into it. They've gotten hooked on it. They keep training. And even if they had they had kids for a couple of years, they might have fallen off the bandwagon a little bit. It's fun to just see how endurance sports, keeps people connected, even if it's, 10 years down the road. And for me, that was some of my most memorable experiences too, is like all these people I've met over the years through endurance sports, whether it's the friends I had at work, the new friends I made, through sport. Like when I did my Ironman World Championships, I did Kona, for the first time, literally the last, I think, 5K of the race as I'm running, it was dark and, I was not a front of the pack finisher, more middle back of the pack. And, just running down the road, all of a sudden I see one person that comes back from memory lane, so to speak, from my first triathlon experience. And then the race director of the first triathlon I ever did was there. And then the guy who got me into coaching was there. And like one by one, it was just like a run down memory lane.
Oh, that's fun.
And I think that's the beauty of, when people get into endurance sports in particular, that the community is very tight and supportive. The longer in distance you go, the more people don't look at it like a neck by neck, like a competition between two people. It's more of a survival challenge to get to that finish line.
So true.
And so, you have this mutual respect for each other, and, people help each other out, whether it's like sharing gels or salt and things like that to get through these challenges. And I think that's the biggest thing. Like, I didn't even realize I was getting into that community when I started getting into endurance sports. And just that, in a world where there's a lot of negative stuff out there, having those positive environments, is a really, really powerful thing. But yeah, I don't think any of them have qualified for Team USA, unfortunately, from that first triathlon we all did together. I might have been the only one that kind of got really deep into it, but yeah, it's fun to be able to reconnect with everybody after many, many years, through this, the beautiful sport of, running and triathlon.
Yeah. Oh,
That's so awesome.
that's so cool. Well, if people want to learn more about you, what you're doing, if they want to work with you, how do they find you? What are some of the offerings you have?
Yeah, I'm in Chicago, so a lot of people know me in Chicago. And invariably, I feel like I have like 1 or 2 degrees of separation with every endurance, coach and community in Chicago. But yeah, I started my own coaching business only a few years ago. So 4-Star Endurance is the name of the company. So you can go to 4starendurance.com. Or just for the metabolic testing, it's metabolicathlete.com is my metabolic testing business. But I work with a lot of different groups and communities. So in Chicago, we have a triathlon training community called Tri312. It's the area code of downtown Chicago. We do indoor triathlons and other kind of in-person training. I do swimming, so I geek out. And, if you're a data person and you like to, learn how to swim, for people who always struggle with swimming, it's 9 times out of 10, it's a breathing issue that is that roadblock for someone learning how to swim. So I geek out on really helping people learn to swim. That's a big, big passion of mine. So, that business is called Skyline Swim. So skylineswim.com for that. For marathon training, it's Team to End AIDS is my big marathon training, charity team. So t2ea.org is their website. And then, I also work with a local bike racing team, Triple X Racing Athletico, partnered with a physical therapy company, Athletico. And then I work for Super Tri, the Chicago Triathlon. So if you get involved in the Chicago Triathlon, I manage all the community programs for Super Tri here in Chicago. So we have a big first timers program, a club program. So any coaches, any clubs, any communities, feel free to reach out to me, through any of those websites. And I have a whole bunch of email addresses too. But the main one is just coach@metabolicathlete.com. So if someone wants to reach me, they can shoot me an email there.
Awesome.
Love it.
I just love how involved you are. Like,
So many irons in the fire.
yeah,
That's awesome.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah, sometimes too mmany.
So one more time, will you just go over the 4 stars of 4-Star Endurance? Because I'd love for people to hear that again.
Yeah. It actually applies in 2 different ways. Like, one is just the 4 sports, like the endurance sports, so swimming, cycling, running, triathlon. So the 4 different endurance sports that I kind of focus on. But in terms of what I call the methods of motivation, it's, make sure you have a plan, a good training plan that is tailored to you. 2, make sure you do some type of regular assessments or testing, whether it's, a field test, even going out and just doing a local 5K. We like to encourage people doing that on almost a monthly or at least bi-monthly basis, or coming in for a lab test, lactate, VO2 or biomechanic, running form, whatever it might be, swimming analysis. So I like to have people do some type of testing roughly once a month. And then learning, you should always be, learning, like train your brain like you train your body, like find something that will just keep you motivated and focused on what you're building towards. And, knowledge and training, your experience can be just as important as training your body physically. So you can have a lot of gains happen outside of the actual like physical activity of endurance sports. And then the 4th star is what I call the Inspire Star. And that's just doing something that is fun and motivating. And it can be anything from volunteerism to, fundraising for a charity, to joining a running club or community, or doing some type of gamification around fitness, like those fun aspects. If you're not doing that, sometimes you can get demotivated. But anyone who does at least one of those things will probably be okay. If you're doing at least 2 or 3 of them, great. But like the shining example that I had was that athlete that won the world championships. She went from just being an age grouper to then just continuously progressing. And she was one of the few athletes I had that was always doing those 4 things really, really well. And if you're consistent with all 4 of those, sky's the limit with what you can achieve.
Love it.
So cool. So many good nuggets packed into this episode. This has been awesome to hear about your experience and learn from you. So thanks so much for coming on and spending time with us today.
Yeah, it was a blast. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Again, everyone that listened, thanks for joining us. As always, remember to like, follow, and subscribe for more content like this. And we'll see you next time. Is a production of KORR Medical Technologies. Ready to take your metabolic testing to the next level? Visit KORR.com to learn more about purchasing our metabolic test equipment.